everyone, and welcome to the Roundup. Heading into week 14, we go through the biggest pieces of news and the best fantasy notes from fantasylife.com to help you dominate your fantasy leagues and help you get into the fantasy playoffs, which are coming up. We've got some upgrades and downgrades to go through this week, also some more injuries that we need to talk about, so let's get into it in the Roundup. All right, let's get things started. We have a wide receiver and a running back upgrade heading into week 14 that you're going to want to hear about because they could be fantasy playoff winners. The wide receiver upgrade that we're going to talk about first is Nico Collins for the Houston Texans. Now, first and foremost, it is so unfortunate, but we did get the news that Tank Dell would be out for the remainder of the season, which is a big blow to this Texans offense. And sure, other guys could step up. You've got Noah Brown, you've got John Mechie, you've got Robert Woods, but ultimately, when fantasy managers look at this offense, it is going to be Nico Collins that does get the upgrade and will step up in this offense. I mean, in week 13, he had 34.1 fantasy points. He's averaging 17.7 fantasy points per game. He's averaging 10.7 targets since his return from that calf injury. So fantasy managers of Nico Collins are going to be very excited for the next few weeks to come. Let's look at some other stats here for Nico Collins. On snaps without Tank Dell, we can see that the target share climbs from 20% to 31%. And then also his air yard share that you can see over here, 25% to 41%. Now, I just want to say we cannot expect him to sustain these kinds of numbers, but it is going to be still really good for the remainder of the season and going into the fantasy playoffs. So that's why Dwayne McFarland in the utilization report right here upgraded him to a low-end wide receiver 1. So any fantasy managers of Nico Collins, congratulations. The next upgrade I want to talk with you about is none other than running back Bijan Robinson for the Atlanta Falcons. And yes, I am asking you to get a little bit excited about Bijan Robinson, even though he is in a Falcons offense with Arthur Smith, who could do anything these next few weeks. But let me throw some stats your way from the utilization report. Over the last 3 games, he has averaged 18.7 attempts and 4.3 targets. And as Dwayne points out in the utilization report, this is not a byproduct of more plays for the Falcons. This is finally the workload that we've been wanting to see all season, and it's happening right now. So the reason I want us to get excited about Bijan Robinson is not only because of the last 3 games, but it's because of the average finish for similar profile running backs since 2012. Dwayne broke it down. It is RB6 finishes with 18.7 points per game. So this is right in line with his 3-game sample that we've seen. So top comps, if you want to get even more excited, you can see over there Dalvin Cook and LaShawn McCoy. So things are really looking up for Bijan Robinson. It has been a rocky road this season, but if things like this stick, then he is going to be a fantasy winner in the playoffs for you. And that is why he was upgraded to that mid-range RB1 status. We've seen it every single week coming in. Small upgrades here and there, and now we've finally seen it with Bijan Robinson. So he looks really good for the fantasy playoffs. The fantasy playoffs are right around the corner, and if you're sitting pretty, if you're already in, or if you're right there on the line, we have a fantasy player that we think you need to go and stash before it's too late. The player I want to highlight here is none other than Rondale Moore for the Arizona Cardinals. Now, this is an article from Ian Hartitz on fantasylife.com where he lists multiple players that you should go and stash, but Rondale Moore caught my attention specifically. He is only rostered in 12% of Yahoo leagues, and let me throw this out there. The Arizona Cardinals are on a bye in week 14. So do not go and pick up Rondale Moore and expect to be able to play him this week. But I think that there are certain elements with Rondale Moore that you can look at and say, okay, he could be a good stash for the playoffs. First of all, this is an offense that could be ascending in the playoffs. And I know you can look at me and say, what, Kendall, the Arizona Cardinals? No way. I get it. Because Kyler Murray hasn't been incredible as a passer as of yet, coming back from that injury. But I think there are some points where when you see Rondale Moore, he has tried to connect with him on some of those deep balls. And the other point I want to make here that Ian Hartitz points out is their schedule for wide receivers in the fantasy playoffs. So let's look around here. So you've got in week 15 versus the 49ers, they're 25th in PPR points per game allowed to wide receivers. And then you say, okay, week 16 at Bears, they're 16th, and week 17 at the Eagles, they're 32nd. So this is the second easiest schedule in weeks 15 to 17 for wide receivers. I know Marquise Brown is still in the mix. He's been a little bit banged up. And then we can see if Michael Wilson comes back, Greg Dortch is going to be pushed back down the depth chart. So there are really good points in here from Ian Hartitz as to why you should really look at Rondale Moore as someone that you should stash going into the fantasy playoffs, because he could be a hidden gem that helps you win. We have a few favorite fantasy plays going into week 14, but Dwayne McFarland is here to tell us why we might want to get a little bit more excited about Devon Achane going into this week.
Yeah, 25.3 fantasy points for Achane this weekend. His second highest opportunity total of the season with 21. He had 17 rushing attempts and 4 targets in this game. Obviously, the Dolphins were just dominating the Commanders. It was 45-15 at the end on the scoreboard. And this is a very similar game script, Marcus, to what we saw earlier in the year whenever we had Achane put up the 51.3 points in week 3. And that was on his season-high 22 opportunities. That was a blowout win over the Broncos, 70-20. So I'm super excited about Achane. Obviously, he's a must-start everywhere. The only thing I will mention is he only had 3 fantasy points in the first half. Played 41% of the snaps. Most of it was on passing downs, only 21% of the rushing attempts. But in the second half, he dominated 77% of the snaps and 70% of the carries. And while, that's a little bit of a concern, it probably levels out. I think the better thing to focus on here is that in a game where they didn't really need to use him, Marcus, and they could have been like, if his knee is a little iffy, let's not use him. They didn't worry about it. They put him out there in that second half and they let him go. So I think it's really a positive for his health. And get this, man. This year, Achane, in games where he gets to at least 40% of the snaps, Marcus, 31.3 fantasy points per game. So even if we're in a scenario where, okay, Mostert's getting the work in the first half and things don't work out perfectly, he doesn't get his 17, 18 touches, he's only averaging 13.5 rushing attempts and 3.3 targets per game, and he's still scoring fantasy points. So even when the game scripts may not work perfectly, if this does end up being a longer-term trend, it's not something you're going to worry about. You just got to play this, man. I don't remember anything like this, to be honest. I've been playing fantasy football for a long time. We've seen some crazy outlier things, but a player scoring as many points consistently as Achane does, even when he doesn't get a ton of touches, it truly is something to behold.
Now, what would this fantasy season be like without having to do another injury report going into a new week? So we got unfortunate news starting with Christian Kirk. Looks like he will miss 6 to 8 weeks for the Jacksonville Jaguars, which basically means for fantasy purposes, his season is over. And that is a huge hit to this offense for Jacksonville. Another one to keep an eye on is Trevor Lawrence. He does have a high right ankle sprain. Looks like he will be fighting an uphill battle, according to multiple reports, to play this weekend. But fingers crossed he's going to be okay. We did get some better news, though. Dawson Knox has been designated to return from IR, and we also saw that Dallas Goedert could be playing again this weekend. So those are 2 good pieces of information coupled with 2 bad pieces of information. Make sure you go and look at the waiver wires, though, and go to fantasylife.com. You could be picking up some quarterbacks like Gardner Minshew, Desmond Ridder, and there are also some wide receivers out there that can help you, like Alec Pierce and Curtis Samuel. I know it's been a really tough stretch for the season, but make sure you continue to look at the waivers before they close and get some of those guys on your team that will help you in the future. All right, now it's time for one of our favorite times in the show. We are going to go through our Underdog Pick'em plays for Week 14. But before we do that, I have to remind you, make sure you go to UnderdogFantasy.com and use the promo code LIFE. When you do that, they will match your first deposit of up to $100. It is a fantastic deal. So again, UnderdogFantasy.com and use promo code LIFE. Now let's get into our favorite plays. All right, now that we're all logged in at UnderdogFantasy.com and we use that promo code, let's go through some of our favorite pick'em plays for Week 14. We're getting back on track here, so I've got 2 for you this week. Amon-Ra St. Brown, I want to go higher on his 72.5 receiving yards. You've got the Detroit Lions going up against the Chicago Bears on the road, but our Fantasy Life projections have him at 85.5 receiving yards, so I think this number is way too low. Next up, I want to go Rachaad White, Tampa Bay Buccaneers Buccaneers going up against the Atlanta Falcons on the road. I want to go higher on his 54.5 rushing yards. For Fantasy Life's projections, they have him at 66.5 yards. So again, I think this number is just way too low. Those are the two plays I like the most, though. Amon-Ra St. Brown higher than 72.5 receiving yards, and then Rachaad White higher than 54.5 rushing yards. Make sure you go fantasylife.com to go and check out those projections, and then go to underdog.com and lock those in. All right, everyone, that was the roundup for week 14. As always, thank you so much for joining me here. Make sure you go to fantasylife.com. Make sure you go check out our rankings, our utilization report tool. Everything that you need to continue dominating your fantasy leagues and win you that championship is going to be all right there, 100% free. And make sure you sign up for that newsletter in your inbox 7 days a week. We'll see you next week for week 15.